Our next session is titled The Future of AI in Financial Services and is moderated by Ovetta Gardenier, Senior Deputy Comptroller for Bank Supervision Policy, Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. Please welcome Ovetta Gardenier and the panel.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. So, as Melissa said, we're going to start off our panel discussions this afternoon with a discussion of the future of AI in financial services. And at this time, I'd like to introduce my esteemed panel who will be joining me for this discussion. First, we have Nicol Turner-Lee, Director for the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. I know they're here. And I'll keep going. Manish Raghavan, Postdoctoral Fellow at the Harvard Center for Research on Computation and Society. Ovetta Sampson is the Vice President for Machine Learning Experience Design at Capital One. And Joanne Stonier, Executive Vice President and Chief Data Officer for MasterCard. Please join me in welcoming the panelists to the stage. Now, please join me in welcoming all the panelists to the stage. All right, so as we started off this morning, really focused on a host of things dealing with AI and machine learning. But at this point in time, what I would say that's really important, at least from a financial regulatory standpoint, is looking at from a financial services offering standpoint, making sure that these products are offered in a safe and sound manner, but also that the institutions treat those customers in a fair manner and provide fair access to those financial services. So the juxtaposition of safety and soundness and fairness in this space is paramount as far as I'm concerned. And oftentimes I've said, you really can't be a safe and sound institution if you're not treating your customers fairly and providing them that fair access. So I'd really like to start the conversation with you, Manish, because I think you've done a lot of research in this space. But more importantly, you've done that research on machine learning and fairness. And I'd really like to see if you could frame for us what those very real opportunities and major considerations are in terms of using machine learning in highly sensitive use cases. And then, tell us a little bit about the options and the model choices that have come from your research.
Sure. Thanks for having us also. Appreciate being here. So modern machine learning is giving us a lot of new opportunities. And I think the best way to really describe it is that machine learning gives us the ability to take in a lot of data, an increasing amount of data really, and make statistically accurate predictions, right? That is really what it is designed to do. Beyond that, it also really gives us an ability to really measure and reflect on our own practices. Once we have data about what we've been doing and the decisions we've been making, we can then use that data to better understand how we've been operating in the past and what changes we might want to make. But one of the major considerations that comes with that is that we shouldn't view machine learning and AI and all of these related tools as things that somehow give us more objectivity, right? At the end of the day, we should think of them as mirrors that really reflect what we have been doing in the past. And so to the extent that we don't agree with past practices, to the extent that we think those are discriminatory, machine learning isn't necessarily the thing that's going to change the way that we behave. The other key consideration that I'd like to point out, and I think the rest of the panelists will really discuss in further detail, is that context really matters a lot. It's not just the tool being used itself. If you limit your scope of intervention to the particular model that you're using or the particular tool that you're using, you're ignoring all of these important considerations around how is this tool being used, what data is it being used on, what are you going to do with those predictions, and what recourse does someone have if they get some sort of adverse decision out of it. So it's important to keep in mind all of these other considerations in the context around the deployment of machine learning. Now, you asked specifically about model choices and how the actual technical details of the model that we choose actually affects the systems that we have. I think the biggest trend that we've seen over the last couple of decades is that we have more and more power to choose models with the properties that we want to have. So, more traditional styles of data analysis and data science, like regression perhaps, are a little bit simpler and they have a limited scope of intervention. But as we get more and more complex and sophisticated models, we actually have more power to implement goals beyond just say maximize the accuracy of our predictions. We might be able to say something like maximize the accuracy of our predictions, but also try to mitigate disparate impact, but also try to increase access to opportunity for those who have been historically underserved. And so as we have these more and more sophisticated models, we have an ability to express other values that we might have. And we have to think hard about what those values should be and how we implement them. But we are getting the benefits of this increased flexibility, and we need to be taking advantage of it.
So Manish, when you talk about that complexity, what do you think are those impacts for fairness and inclusion?
I think the opportunities that it gives us really comes with the flip side of a responsibility to duly consider the values that we have. So we can't just plead ignorance and say, this is what the data told me to do, and so I'm going to do it. We have to really think hard about, beyond just what the data says about what we've done in the past, how do I affirmatively shape the future to look like what I want it to look like, and to reflect what we think is of fair in our society today. And so this, I think, increased flexibility comes with a responsibility that I think this panel is designed to really help us think about how we take advantage of it.
So Joanne, with that increased responsibility that Manish is talking about, can you tell us about some real-life applications for how MasterCard deploys AI ML, and what strategies you recommend for leveraging what AI offers while managing the risk and those new complexities that come up?
Yeah, sure. So I agree with a lot of what Manish is saying, and I think first, we have a framework that we deploy when we think through our use cases. And the most obvious one for us is fraud prevention, but also there are less obvious ones that I'll talk about when you think about what we've done to provide what we call our set of COVID insights, right? So when COVID happened, there were so many of our customers that needed to understand what was happening and what was going to happen to their businesses. And so from an economic perspective, as the virus swept the globe, we were trying to help our customers understand what was going to happen in one jurisdiction, in one global location. How is that going to possibly impact them in the same sector as the virus began to spread? What was it going to do to their supply chain? So our data was very powerful, and AI was really helping us in that manner. And now even in the war in the Ukraine, as we're using AI to be able to help displaced individuals, right, get back on their feet, but not have our fraud screens actually pop up because these cardholders now are transacting in jurisdictions and locations where they've never transacted before. But when I think about what Manish is saying around fairness and safety and soundness, right, it really does go to, do you understand the purpose to which you're putting AI to? Because really, AI is a really unique tool in the analytic toolkit in that it's able to process vast amounts of data, which is great. But what it can't tell you is if you don't look at the data sets that you're feeding it, and we talk about data in my organization as the food for AI, you really need to understand the characteristics of those data sets, and not just the accuracy, the consistency, and the qualities of the data set, but really what are those other characteristics that you're not looking at? And I always use as my go-to example, the 1910 voter rolls in the United States may be perfectly accurate if you're doing a historical study, but if you aren't, they absolutely are not the characteristics of today's society. And so you shouldn't be using that to predict for today's society, right? It's going to have inordinate flat sides. And many data sets have not been created for the purposes you're putting it to use. So that's the first thing. So what are you doing? Is the data right for the purpose? But then, models, right? We talk a lot about model creation, and I think we think our data scientists understand the connection between purpose and outcomes, and they are often engineers who are very, very good at their jobs. And we talk a lot about now having inclusion as, at the table, and that's absolutely key and important to have a diversity of perspectives in solving problems and creating models. But you also have to connect for engineers, not just their data science to the outcome. So I was talking to Nicol when we were backstage about how we had a very diverse group of modelers who were actually hell-bent on solving the problem of actually getting around our bias screens. And so they were working together, as data scientists do, to solve the data problem. But they didn't understand we actually wanted them to actually solve the bias in the data, not actually solve the problem of the equation, right? And we wanted to actually look at the outcomes. And they were a bunch of very young people, right? And we figured it out through peer review and other techniques. But if you don't really connect all of this, right, from a design perspective of your process and your governance, you're going to still get outcomes that you are not desired. And so all of these steps, I think, are part of a responsible framework that organizations such as mine have to have. But then, because we operate an ecosystem, as I then pass to Ovetta here, right, because she's in Capital One, one of my banks, I have to make sure that if she's going to use one of my fraud models, what we built it on is all MasterCard data, and her data may have other flat sides or other vagaries that she has to then utilize as she's then working with any of my data scientists. So all of this has to be taken into consideration, I think, in kind of what Manish is talking about. And we'll probably hear more from Ovetta.
I'm sure we will, because I think when I listen to you talk, one thing I know is our regulations in this area, they're primarily principles-based, right? Model governance, appropriate controls, separation of duties, outcome analysis, all of those things. But how do those principles actually hold up when you're talking about AI and machine learning models? You know, are there new principles we should consider, or are these the principles that should continue to be the baseline? Ovetta, I'm going to start with you, but I'm going to encourage you guys to jump in, because, you know, we should be having a wonderful conversation here in the living room with no one else watching.
Yeah, feel free to jump in. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I appreciate being able to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart. One of the things that I have talked about when it comes to AI and machine learning in the regulatory space. So, as you know, banks are heavily regulated for fair lending, making sure that our models as well as our products do not have disparate impact, and that extends to our AI and ML models. And so banks have been in the model development business for a while now, right? Like, this isn't a new space for us, but I think one of the challenges for banks is what I call the human engagement risk. We're really good on the disparate impact risk or fairness risk or risk of being not in fair lending. We've gotten a model governance infrastructure already. We have model risk officers who our model development process is stage gated so that we have separate and separate risk officers who look at how our models are developed along the way. But our challenge, I think, in banking is how our models engage with humans and the public, and the risks that could appear there that aren't as easily to point out as whether there's fair lending or fraud or other kinds of things that we've already known to do in model governance. And that includes on the risk of psychological risks or cognitive risks, cognitive biases, those kinds of things that happens when I do get turned down for credit and I feel really bad, right? Like, and I'm an African-American woman, and I may think, hey, is this a fair thing that I got turned down, but somebody else did not? And so that's a risk, right? And so I think for us, our challenge in the banking industry is that we marry our current risk management structure with what I call the human engagement risk governance. So making sure that we see AI and ML as a technical problem, right? Not just a technology problem, that it has an ecosystem of engagement and that includes societal, institutional biases, institutional racism, sexism, ableism, all those things. It's not just about the the predictive modeling that we use, that we have to bring that into the model development process. So we also have a framework when we're starting with models. We start with model intent. Well, model intent can't just be about numbers now, right? It can't just be about predictions now. Model intent has to be about, we have to look at harms modeling. Is this the applicable use of AI and ML? Don't presume, I have 10 commandments of mindful AI, and one of them is don't presume the desirability or applicability of AI and ML. So when we're looking at the intent of a model, we have to go through this process to say, is this the right use case for this technology? And if we do use it, what could be the possible human harms of using this technology? So that's new, right? Like that's not something that's built into model governance, right? And so I think that's something that banks and other places. I think we're a little bit ahead of other places because we have to, but I think all of us in industry needs to consider.
And so from a financial inclusion perspective, right, I mean, my point on the data, and we include all these things. So our governance framework keeps expanding. So we started out with, I don't know, 5 or 6 steps. We're up to something like 12 steps, right? I mean, so I'm kind of with you because what keeps happening is the more you do, the more you learn in this area, right? And so when you think about that, you know, of American households, right, making $40,000 or less annually, right? Almost a quarter of those, right, do not have access, right, to the financial system. Well, then the data, back to my first point, is missing, right? So we're going to have those blind spots, and we're not going to design well. And so that's exactly and then we're going to have the outcomes that Ovetta's talking about, right? So if we already know that going in to solving the problem, we can't solve it just with AI. We have to make sure that we're thinking more broadly, right? And so, and we believe, you know, in the partnership across both the financial sector and the government sector to begin to solve some of these challenges, right? Because we need not only better data sets, and it's not just AI that's going to solve some of this, but that we have to really create coalitions and commissions to solve these problems, right? So yesterday, MasterCard was one of several companies along with the Aspen Institute that started an effort along these lines to begin to create kind of inventories of ways that we can begin to combat this, right? To catalog efforts around financial inclusion, compile sectors of data, and design a path forward to begin to understand what are these other kind of social issues that are impacting some of the financial inclusion issues so that we can design better moving forward, right? And so I think that we have to think this way, both from a data science perspective, but also just from a social perspective, because otherwise we are not going to really hit some of the social justice issues as we look at the outcomes that we really desire. It's going to be absolutely impossible.
So it's really interesting. Oh, Nicole, you were going to say something.
No, I'm waiting my turn.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting. I hear you all talking about the use of AI and machine learning, and it feels like, and Manish, I think you were saying this, prior to now, focused totally on accuracy. All models just really focusing on getting the accuracy of that data, which seems to be not enough in this day and time, because the models can be expanded. Mm-hmm. But if we're talking about expanding them, what are your thoughts about the best practices? Let's say that a financial institution or a company like MasterCard can use while they're managing the prudential and the consumer protection risks associated with the products and services that are being offered.
Well, I guess I'll jump in. I mean, I come not from a company, but from an academic perspective and a policymaker perspective. And I think part of the conversation that we're having when we talk about AI and where we sort of see these challenges where there's a disconnect between the technical cadence and the sociological realities of what people experience on a day-to-day basis, a lot of that starts with who's at the table when you're actually creating the AI. So you have to start there. If you have people who do not understand the lived experiences of the subjects in which they're applying the technology, the context suffers. And what you have is a high reputational risk for the companies that are here, because what you've done is basically systemically discriminated or created predatory outcomes. And at the end of the day, AI is only successful and trustworthy when people believe it is. Not necessarily when companies do, but what the people who actually use it do. I think the other thing that I've heard when we talk about data, which I think is really important to point out, is that when we look at the financial services area, it's not a clean area. We have a historical legacy where people have not been given the same type of attribution when it comes to the wealth gap. African Americans in particular have less than a quarter of the wealth of whites. We also come from a system where some of that was intentionally designed to sort of redline people out of those marketplaces. So I like what Manish is saying is we can't assume that the technology is going to get rid of the explicit and implicit biases that we've created ourselves. So how I like to think about it, and Dr. Renee Cummings at UVA sort of put me onto this, is that we're actually dealing with traumatized data sets. Those traumatized data sets carry the legacies of what our society has emboldened into the information that we collect. And as a result, particularly when you don't have people who don't necessarily live those traumatic experiences, because many people are resilient because we're still here, but what they aren't able to do is sort of interrogate that data in a way where it makes sense. You think about the work of Dr. LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard, who suggested that people who had Black-sounding and Latino-sounding names, basically the algorithm directed predatory products and services to them because they would name Juan or LaQuisha or something else. The question becomes, how are we dealing with those traumatized data sets, and what are we doing to create better data sets? And Joanne and I have worked together because I find banking to be really interesting, because you have litmus tests when it comes to measuring disparate impact. A bank cannot get away from their regulatory construct of creating disparate impact that lends itself to what Ovetta said, unfair lending practices or exclusion. But let me go a little further. But there are people, because of this trauma, that are not actually recognized. We call them the credit invisible.
Yes, we do.
So as a result, they also cannot participate.
And they're missing. They're just plain old missing from the data.
Plain old missing data. But guess what happens when you're missing data?
And you have proxy variables that even if we remove things, that there are other variables that the machine will begin to learn and replace. I love the word traumatized data. I wrote it down because I hadn't heard that one yet, so I learned something today. But what will happen is the machine will still, because of these traumatized data sets, the machine will actually, even if we remove everything that we can think of that's a traumatized piece, the machine will relearn it from some other data that's in the data set.
Or the machine will, so I give this example of the recent financial services that are like the lending, pay now, pay later. We don't know, because of the opaqueness of the internet, who sees those things.
Right.
People who are not online, who do not have a built-up credit history, people who are not necessarily contributing data into the footprint are not going to see those things. And so we experience, I think, with populations that we all care about, how do you actually navigate through this tax that it's not necessarily being acted upon in malfeasance, but it's creating outcomes that replicate the systemic biases. We all in this room want AI to do much better than we do, but we can't because we are the AI. And I think that's part of the challenges in the financial services industry when you start dealing with these very sensitive areas where people are already behind. How do you create technologies where people can actually partake in it in a productive way?
And thank you so much for that, because I think this is why I'm on this side of the aisle, because I have radical thoughts about being more mindful about our AI. And one of the things, my 10 commandments is beware of the sin of omission, right?
Right.
We cannot sit back and say that model isn't overfitted, so it's fine, right? And I think one of the ways that we're trying to address the fact that everything we do as humans ends up in code is for us to, A, be aware that and acknowledge that, and not fool ourselves into thinking that we're going to mitigate bias. That's one of the first things that we have to get out of our lexicon, because we are the bias, right? And I think one of the things when we're approaching model intent, there's 9 steps to creating a model in our framework. And when we're having that model intent conversation, it is a conversation. It is not just the model developer, right? It's not just the data scientist. It's the model developer. It's a team of engineers. It's a human-centered researcher. It's a human-centered designer. It's what I call a UX data science designer specialist. I'm just making all this up.
No.
But
I was talking earlier today about the need for data designers, and,
right.
and it's a new skill set that is different, talking exactly about
right.
this. And I was saying I need more organizations that understand the need for this skill at the table. So happy to hear you're making up the same words. Good.
So these people who are on my team have anthropological backgrounds. They have backgrounds in sociology. They have backgrounds in psychology, but they also understand how to do a regression model, right? And I think we're not looking for unicorns. We're just looking for different mental models to all equally and equitably have something to bring to the table to decide when we're going to use AI and what we're going to use it for. And not only are we having those conversations with people from multiple backgrounds, but I have an HCI degree and a computer science degree, but we definitely have co-participatory design. So it's this revolutionary idea where I say, why don't you bring people who are affected by collections into the discussion about how do we build a model that decides who we sue or whatever. So this idea of surrendering power, right? The power has always been in the hands of the creator, and now what I call it is widening the narrative about who can be the creator and who is in the room when these models are created. That is the only way that we're going to be able to combat some of these disproportionate or some of these traumatized outcomes. Yeah. And if we think we're going to be able to do it with the technology, we're fooling ourselves.
Well, can I jump in really, just real briefly on that? So I love that model because when Joanne and I met a few years ago, we were working on like our signature Brookings paper on this. Because I work on digital divide stuff, so I'm always about the technology, social justice, and race. But I love that because I think it's forcing companies to think differently about how they actually manage processes, which I think is very attuned to where we are in this debate. But I also think, and I have a piece coming out in a book with Oxford University Press on this feedback loop, though, that we have to have with consumers and this disclosure. So some of the things I've been talking about is, where do consumers come in and help you in the development of AI? So in this,
that's right.
I'm so into.
So we are totally.
We are aligned.
My lawyers tell me not to say we are working on this, but there is this idea to work on explainability. But one of the things that a lot of our challenges is to turn the black box into a glass box, right? But the way that a lot of frameworks have looked at it is that the box belongs solely to the box creator.
Right.
So one of the things that we're trying to widen the idea is that the box belongs to the creator and the people who are being affected by what the box is doing. And so you can, what is it called? It's called machine learning. It can learn, right? And who should it learn from? It can learn from the people that you build it to impact. Right. And you can build in, and we talked about this, now that we're getting more powerful tools that are used, let's get meta here, that are AI and ML, you can build in tools into your platform to do what my other 10 commandment is, listen for unintended consequences. And so allowing people who are being impacted by models to give you feedback on how that model is doing. You can design it that way. There's no reason why you can't.
Well, let me stop if I can, because I'm a little different than your lawyer. So let me just stay on this thing, because I would be remiss if I didn't say this. So I think you're right, that you can actually build in those kinds of guardrails into your model development. But I'm going to be honest, what you guys do on the data science and computer science side is what you do. I'm a sociologist. I care about outcomes, right? So how you get to the point where you can de-bias that, to me, is great, because that means we've made breakthroughs in the computer and data science space. What I've been suggesting is how you do a couple of things that combine what you're doing on this self-regulatory mode, Ovetta and Joanne, is excellent. Because people need to know that you're taking the time to put that into your model development. But then it can't stop there. We have a series of civil rights laws, a regime that the banks know quite well of things that you can and cannot do. So your AI also needs to be lawfully compliant.
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely.
Of course.
And I don't think either of us is suggesting it shouldn't.
But it also needs to disclose, right? It needs to tell.
Well, that's what explainability
and I think that's what explainability, and I think we both would use transparency.
Yeah, but let me finish just a minute. But it has to disclose. People have to know that this is compliant, or it's not going to work on you. It's not going to render the same results because we've tested it, and there's a possibility, like in facial recognition, that every time I change my hair, it's not going to see me. And I think the third
now,
thing,
facial recognition is different.
But I'm just saying, but you got to disclose.
We don't do that.
Or another thing, like, or you can't use your Credit Karma score and go buy a car because that's based on an algorithm. I'm just giving you examples of what people don't know. The last thing I would just say, what I've been trying to do, Ovetta, which I think is complementary to what you said, what you're doing, is then how do you get consumers to help you in your trustworthiness? So I'm not actually suggesting that it starts at the beginning. I'm suggesting, I'm suggesting that it comes, and Joanne, you've heard me talk about this, with some type of seal, better housekeeping seal, Energy Star rating.
Yeah, we can do Amazon referrals, right? Like so I love this algorithm. Yeah. That one don't mess with.
Exactly.
Yeah, I totally. I hear what you're saying.
So I can say I'm not going to go and use that algorithm because the last time I did, I was denied credit 10 times.
But let me ask one thing. Let me bring you guys to this, because I think that what I'm hearing is that we know big data is the fuel for AI. That's it.
Yes.
Okay, so and then what I'm picking up from this conversation is, there are risks and there are challenges as well as opportunities to getting that consumer data in order to use it. But how do you deal with those risks, especially when you're talking from the perspective of bringing the consumer into the room?
Yeah,
when Nicol is talking about the true impact, that disparate impact, and I don't have to go through the regulatory structure, but Nicol is absolutely right. There is a system of laws out there that are very clear for every company, and for most people, they understand. They may not know the technicalities of those laws, but they know that the law requires that any financial product should be offered to me on a fair basis. It's the fairness aspect that you're trying to pull out of this data. Help me understand how you're dealing with those challenges, particularly from a customer.
Go first, only because she's a B2C company and we're more B2B, but I will reserve the right to just chime in here. As a B2B company that enables a lot of B2C interactions, I would like to just have a moment to talk to this, because it's a challenge when you don't have the direct relationship but want to offer transparency as to your role. So I do want a moment to just chime in, but go ahead, because I know you're going to go there.
I know, poor Manish. We're sorry.
Yeah,
I know, we're sorry.
Manish's still here.
We're sorry.
You just jump in anytime.
Anytime, but go ahead.
I think, first of all, you can call it data bill of rights. You can call it, whatever you want. But one of my first commandments is all people create data, and all data is created by people, and don't divorce the two, right? So when you're dealing with data, you have to understand that there is a person, or even though it's aggregate and it's big data or whatever, but you can go down to an individual that data represents, right? And so when we're dealing with data, we know that we're dealing with people, right? And people have a right to know who's collecting their data, what we're using their data for, as well as how long that data is being collected, where that data is being stored, how secure that data is. Like that's a baseline, right? Like that's table stakes for us and our customers, because if we can't produce that lineage of how we're using their data, then how in the heck are they going to trust us? And we're not a transactionary bank, right? Like we want to develop a relationship with you. And so we know that relationships are built on trust. And so our number one goal is to make sure that our customers and consumers understand how we protect their data, how we use their data, and also give them agency over their data with us. And I think that's really important, not just the fact that you're telling them, here's what we're collecting, but that you have agency to revoke that collection, right? And And one of the things that, now my lawyers are probably gonna be like, shh, but one of the things I think that is a challenge for us in this industry is why do we have to have these blanket consents, right? Why can't we have privacy by default and iterative consent? Why can't we design consent to be an iterative process rather than this kind of like one check box and does all? Like that doesn't build trust, right? Like you're just like, I'm just gonna hand over like my firstborn to you and never hear from you again. And I think one of the things that I talk about a lot when I speak to data scientists and others who are designing these models is, we have to balance the give-get loop, right? So what am I getting for what am I giving up? And really being transparent about the benefits for me renting your data, right? Renting, right? I say that provocatively, but what do I get as a consumer for allowing you to collect this data and use this data and store this data? And I think it's incumbent upon institutions to be able to have a fair balance there. It shouldn't be you give me everything and I only give you a little bit of convenience, right? Like we need to balance the give-get loop there. And so that's a challenge too.
But it feels like in some ways, and this goes back to the very first panel of the day, trust is at the foundation of everything in financial services. But the trust dynamic seems to be shifting. And, perhaps trust was given to financial services institutions decades ago. Now you need to earn it. And that poses a different challenge, I think, not only for the creation of the models, but the delivery of the products and the services.
And I think that's why I want to chime in here, because if you think about the financial sector, right, the financial sector is actually changing radically. And up here you have two organizations in MasterCard and Capital One where we've actually been part of the very traditional financial sector, but the financial sector is changing.
Yes.
If you look on your phone, any of you out in the audience, right, you have Robinhood, you have Mint, you are transacting, you have Rocket Mortgage, I know Capital One doesn't want me to say that, but you have ways of transacting now that you have never really done before financially, right, that is also using your data in ways that's different and less secure and variated than the traditional interactions you had with financial institutions before. And so we have to partner with different organizations that are using data in very different ways. And we have to still up the ante on trust because you are accessing through my systems, through your bank, all right, your data, and you're using it in new and different ways. And so we also have had to make sure that we're being very transparent as you are asking us to help you transact in new ways with organizations that are very, very varied in their data practices. And so individuals also need to be aware, right? So we have the same, you own your own data, you should control your own data, you have an absolute right to privacy and security, right? And you should also understand the benefits of what you are getting from that interaction, right? Yes. Those are our 4 principles all the time. And we also believe that all organizations are only stewards of your data. You have the best right to your data, no matter how many organizations you are giving your data to or sharing your data with. But in return, we better be accountable, we better be transparent, we better have integrity in our practices with you, but we're also going to innovate, right? We're going to obviously do privacy and security, but when we do innovation, and that integrity moment means we better have the ability to be transparent and interact with you. And so the ability to gather the consent moment and interact with you and then provide to you back that audit trail that kind of Ovetta is talking about. How have we used your data? What are we using it for? Those are going to be the ethical responsibilities of organizations to be able to demonstrate it. And it's going to require, though, kind of this consumer interaction, individual interaction, and demand it. Because otherwise, AI in all those interactions, right? If you think about these complex ecosystems that are happening, this is going to be a runaway train, which is back to the point that, we have organizations that are dedicated to this, and then we have a lot of emerging organizations that need to think this through. What are their responsibilities? Because the world is getting more complex, ecosystems are getting more complex, financial systems are getting more complex and global. How are we going to develop this in a way that's still super responsible to the individuals who need financial access, that need it to be fair, that need it to be equitable? But I got to tell you, the speed of change is just magnified. And just wait till the metaverse catches up with our physical reality, folks. The data's going to be wild. So just saying all of that, and identity management, making sure your avatar, I guess, matches up with your physical persona. We've got a lot of challenges ahead of us, and we do need to figure this out as a financial community. Yes. So I think that there's an awful lot on our roadmap.
I want to bring you back in, Manish, so I'm going to kind of slide into your corner real minute. You know, I think what we're talking about from a policymaker perspective goes back to the fact that in the U.S. we don't have privacy policy that's federally based, that's uniform and sets out standards. I think most of us would agree that the consent-based framework is just archaic and we need to move away from that. And in some recent conversations that I've had, I think we need to think about where in the trail of these predictive decisions do we need to spend more time when it comes to the duty of care. So I love the way you give the analogy, Ovetta, about, you know, banks used to go to the bank, give the money to the teller, and you just kind of knew the teller was going to put it in the vault, right?
Exactly.
Now, with your data, you sort of put the data on the internet, and you don't know where it's going to land up. And a lot of that is the result of, has resulted in us talking about algorithmic bias. You know, I'm a huge a fan of the fact of this argument that we probably wouldn't have such untethered and out of control algorithmic bias if we had better privacy legislation. Yeah. Because we'd have a clear sense out of the 100 million variables that are out there in a person's digital footprint that there's only a few that we can actually touch. Yeah. With that being the case, I do think this is worth a conversation. That's why I'm bringing you in. So just get ready. You better take this mic while you have it. Is this idea of third-party audits, right? Independent third-party audits, as technical assessments, litmus tests. You know, when I was doing my research on the Energy Star rating, I went to banks. And there was a litmus test with quantitative modelers to suggest if a proxy was going to mirror a disparate impact. So having those built in, better training, so what you all are talking about, but also getting folks to understand, and I'll put it out here, something we're working on at Brookings, this anti-racist framework to AI. What does that mean in terms of what you need to read? How do you need to, I mean, it's no secret. The social scientists like myself, when I was going to school, my mother was like, a sociologist, really? What are you going to do with that? Hi, Mom, I'm at the Commerce Department, right? Part of it is social scientists and data scientists do not have those conversations in productive ways. So when they come to your companies, they understand it, you know? So you're sort of getting people along, much like we've done with other corporate initiatives, but how do we start from the pipeline?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Go ahead, man.
So I think that's where we actually need a lot of innovation now, because one thing that we really don't know how to do well is how to audit AI. Like, we talk about impact assessments, we talk about third-party audits, but those are incredibly hard to standardize. Right? It's very hard to go to company A and company B and say, I've audited both of those. How do I compare the results? How do I know who has better practices? Where is one person doing well and one is not? And so that, I think, is where we need to see experimentation and innovation today. Because going forward, we need to be able to have a third party come in and standardize and say, here's what we're going to do across the industry, or here's the best practices that we're going to set. And currently, we just don't really have that consensus. And I think that's what we're working towards now.
And I just want to take a second. We are audited, but go ahead.
I just want to take a second because we got about 7 minutes left. And I do want to make sure that if anyone in the audience has questions for this panel, and you see this panel is on fire, so there are a couple of mics right at the front here. So if you have questions, please come down. I will look for anyone who wants to pose a question. Ovetta, I'm turning it back over to you while we wait to see.
Prior to coming to Capital One, I was a social science. I mean, that was my thing. So I totally get, like, I'm both sides of this. It's like half of Ovetta is over here and half is there. But one of the things that I had run into in my research is this idea of intellectual property. So when we're talking about algorithm bias and auditing and looking at model lineage and data lineage and trying to trace how things are put together, how the Legos go together, you run up against the IP argument. Yep. And I don't know necessarily, I don't have a solution to that, but I do know that that's definitely one of the challenges for trying to standardize how we build models.
But all right, we got a question. Oh. Thank you.
Hi there. Irene, I'm currently at Hugging Face, and I previously built bias and social impact work at OpenAI. And my question is, how do we appropriately collect diverse human feedback, building these representative groups for human feedback, and collect that in a non-exploitative way? So what should compensation look like?
All right.
Yeah,
Nicol?
no, I love that. So I think this is where Congress has to come in. I think Congress should play a role in increasing the appropriations to colleges and universities who want to engage in these diverse data sets, that if the companies, can't do it, I think we should have researchers do that. It also gives us an opportunity to open up this space to HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, and Hispanic serving institutions, so that we can bring in more folks. I think there's also, from a policy perspective, the regulatory sandbox. I'm a huge fan.
Yep.
If you want to know more about me as a black woman, just ask me, and ensure that there is the appropriate protections on both sides, so that I don't land up, and I give this example often, and Ovetta probably know about, Henrietta Lacks,
Yes.
where we took the data of a black woman to solve cancer, and she left an impoverished person who died without being healed by the use of her own stem cells. What I'm suggesting is, I think there's a praxis that we have to put together that allows us to sort of have this reciprocity under the guardrail of potentially a regulatory sandbox, in my opinion. And I think the other way that we also protect groups is that the challenge that we have in technology is that we operate from what Adam Thierer called permissionless innovation. Break it and apologize later. This permissionless forgiveness has become the reason why we're here today. I think it's really important for companies to really assess, much like I have to do as a social scientist, my human subject care. I don't mind, and some people disagree with me, some singular variables that are for market surveillance. I love patent leather shoes. Market as many as you want. I like some of these financial service markets. I've given consent every time I click, implicitly. But I don't like it when it's sort of correlated in ways that it doesn't make sense for me. Whereas, for example, my buying of patent leather shoes lends itself to be assumed that based on other things on the internet that I do, that I may, be broke, or I may need credit, or I may be, which leads to those denials. So I think we have to have a serious conversation in sensitive use cases like financial services, like employment, like healthcare. How do we deem the handling of human subjects for marketplace consumption? Yeah. And that's where I think we have to have a duty of care that we've not spoken about.
I think it's like a shifting of paradigm.
Yeah. Right.
From,
And I think
this is not just the technology, right?
Right.
It's a social,
Right.
it's a social technical that has impact to society. And I think, one of the things that when I was at Microsoft, we did harms modeling, right? Like that's a sociology framework, but,
And I think
we applied it to the technology, and it's really important that we think about that. But the thing about the data sets that I think, also when I was at Microsoft, one of the things that we tried to do is to, a lot of the data sets for Cortana and Alexa and Siri were based on, Enron trials, because it's free, right? Like that data is out there and free, but it's not fair and it's not equitable.
No.
And so how do we again beware of the sin of omission? How do we bring in people who have been omitted historically in data collection into the fold willingly, compensated correctly, but also giving them a place of honor?
Well, one thing, and I see you guys, I'm coming, but one thing I think that I noticed about this conversation that is a shift that I've seen through my career is, I think you called it renting the consumer's data. But when I first came into bank regulatory space, banks owned that data.
Right.
And so the dynamic and the conversation is shifting. Again, that goes along with the shifting dynamic of trust.
Well, a court case is coming on that. I can tell you that right now.
I see one question here. I see two. I see this gentleman at the mic. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Josh New, IBM. This is the first panel I've been to in 3 years, so it's great to be back.
Great.
Really awesome discussion. Something that I'm really curious about, and I see get brought up every now and then, but haven't seen a lot of major scholarship or headway in Congress being made, is that this is especially true in financial services, but in general, a lot of consumer protection frameworks prohibit the collection of sensitive protected class information for understandable reasons. Like we don't want to introduce that thing that could so clearly cause bias to wreak havoc in loan processing
And
and
how do we know
housing
if we're-
But how do we then know? You're right. Yeah.
But
But
at the same time, that also makes it very difficult to test these models for bias before you deploy them.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
absolutely.
I'm just wondering how you're navigating this in the financial services industry. Are there like clever ways around this? Are you supporting, legislative changes to figure out how to do this better? And any thoughts in general?
Here's where the lawyers tell me to say our challenge in the industry, right? But to your point, technology is helping us to do that.
That's right.
We actually have algorithms who can take non-labeled data and figure out if there's protective classes in there to see if it's being biased
And
how it's being treated.
Yeah.
And that there's a human in the loop there, so it's not just all mechanical or it's not just all algorithmic. But you bring up a real conundrum, right? Like because we have to it is illegal actually for us to even know if there's a protective class in some of our data sets when we're building these models. How do we ensure that we're not having inequitable
this
impact?
is one of the challenges, even in laws outside the United States, privacy laws, and when we get into other laws being adopted, if we're not really thoughtful about this is one of the places where we do need some exceptions. We do need new thinking, because this is actually one of the challenges. If we want to design well, we actually need the freedom to use data in the right ways. But I said this earlier today, that if we do not then lock down things, once we use it in the right ways, it can be used for the wrong things, right? So this goes back to very basic data governance practices, right? And so on the previous point, what you'll find most really forward-thinking organizations doing, they are taking best practices out of healthcare, research, to actually do governance in a very different way, so that we are kind of using things from medical science, right? Using different techniques, having review boards, having oversight boards, having different professions actually look at data science, emphasizing the science in what we're doing to understand all of these different flat sides. But it's a real issue that, yes, I agree the technology is helping us, but it's not perfect. And so we do need some assistance in this area.
All right, Joshua writing about it.
Yep.
Working on it. We literally have 5 seconds, and I'm going to ask you to please ask your question.
Hi, I'm Brian Stanton. I'm a human factors cognitive scientist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I was interested to hearing the panel's opinion of the relationship between trust and system trustworthiness.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just be really brief. I think that is a great question. It's a great correlation. I sort of associate that with reputational risk and have looked really closely at the EU model on high-risk algorithms. I think there's something to be said about how they're sort of navigating, again, through these high-risk scenarios that have these adverse effects. And so the challenge, and I think what's so interesting about this conversation, there's really no one person responsible. I was at Stanford last week. I feel like I've seen the same people from last week. And Eric Schmidt, I asked him this question, like, who's responsible for this? And at the end of the day, there is really no right answer, because it's really the collaborative of the ecosystem that has to be responsible. But that's where I think, again, touting the work that I'm doing, some recognition or label. I call it the Energy Star rating, because we have that in the consumer appliance business, where consumers know that this has gone through the rigor of what we've heard to ensure that I'm not going to be in any way discriminated against or deceived in the practices and the operation of this AI. We need something like that. I'm happy to share more about it.
Yeah, I would just add on to that, though. I do think that there's a difference between the technology and the security and the data use.
Yes.
And so I think you have to have both kinds of labeling, because otherwise you can have a very, very secure system but still have really bad data practices. And so I think we just have to be careful not to conflate the two. So I do think that there's I think, a need for both, but you have to actually have both kinds of trust.
I want to thank this panel for a robust discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much.